while the people are joining, we will continue our tradition of asking you an icebreaker question, and that allows people to join. There should also be an ability, Rick, if that's correct, for the audience to give their preference. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and then ask our beloved panel to give their answers to our icebreaker question. If I can first share the right screen. So again, welcome to everybody. And the question is the following. So I really like karaoke, and maybe at one point in time we will go and do karaoke together. So I was really curious to understand, what's your favorite healthcare themed duet? Is that Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell with Ain't No Mountain High Enough? Is it Queen and David Bowie with Under Pressure? Sonny and Cher with I Got You Babe? Or obviously we couldn't leave this one out, Don't Go Breaking My Heart with Elton John and Kiki Dee. Let's go in alphabetical order here. Ajay, could you please give us a quick introduction of you, who you are, what organization you work for, and then give us the answer to this burning question, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. My name is Ajay Haryani. I'm a physician and one of the clinical leaders at Galileo, which I think we'll talk more about in a bit. But I think my answer to this question is 100% Ain't No Mountain High Enough, 10 out of 10 times.
Great, thank you. Joel, you're next.
Oh, it's tough. So if I go by the music, I would go with Queen, Under Pressure. But if I go with the healthcare duet theme, and the importance of a team and relationship, I'll go with I Got You Babe, Sonny and Cher.
Nice. Okay, then sorry, I think it was first Jamie and then Joel. I got my alphabet wrong. Jamie, please, you're up next.
We're just doing our own order. I gotta go with Ain't No Mountain High Enough. Again, anytime. So I agree. In brief introduction, I know we'll get more into this, but again, thank you for having me here. I'm the VP of Network Strategy Operations at Maven Clinic, which is the largest virtual services clinic serving any path to parenthood and supporting women and families.
Great. And then Sandy, you're last, not least.
I guess we're going 2 on 2 here. I would also say I Got You Babe. Definitely feeling the Cher vibes. And I know we'll get to this in a little bit, but I'm Sandy. I'm one of the ops leaders at Firsthand, which is serving Medicaid individuals with serious mental illness.
Okay, great to have all of you. A quick thank you to you all for joining. I know everybody's really busy, so that's great. We have more than 580 people registering for this webinar, so it's really a topic that's on a lot of people's mind. CareOps has been growing like crazy over the last couple of months, so we're really happy with that. The session will be recorded and sent to everybody who registered. There's Q&A at the end, but we also got questions from the audience prior to the session, so some of the questions that we'll go through are coming straight from the audience. To the audience, you also have the ability to write additional questions in the chat while the session is in its course. Rick, my colleague, is also on the session, and he will be making sure that some of those questions flow to me while we go through. And then, ultimately, our aim is to fuel the dialogue around CareOps. So you can help by spreading the word and fueling that dialogue by tweeting with #CareOps or LinkedIn or using other channels that you can speak to your network about. So in a moment, we will dive a bit deeper into each of the organizations that the panelists are representing. Before we do that, a very quick refresher on what CareOps is. And I'll reshare my screen for that. So for the people who are new to this concept, CareOps is bringing together different roles, so clinical operations, product people, engineering, even compliance people. Very often they work in a fragmented way, but CareOps wants to bring them together so that they can collaborate on building, operating, and continuously improving care flows that have the following objectives. One is to improve outcomes for patients and also increase care delivery efficiency. Now, what is a care flow? care flow can exist anywhere in, let's say, the end-to-end care journey that care providers organizations are supporting. So you see a couple of these potential names on the screen. We consider all of these care flows, and many more names exist for care flows, but care flows is a very good umbrella term, let's say. Now, the way that care flows are currently built and implemented and ultimately improved is pretty broken, because what we see is what very often happens is a lot of inputs are gathered from many different sources. There's evidence-based guidelines, existing processes, data to be captured, tasks to be completed. And then a lot of time is spent by these roles to map all of the ideal flows in largely static tools. There's Miro, PowerPoint, Word, Excel, you name it. And then ultimately, a lot of resources are spent to hard code those flows into the existing tech stacks. Can be patient-facing apps, can be EMRs, can be practice management applications. And there's a lot of iteration going on to ultimately get to the right implementation. Because it takes so much resources, so much time, in reality, we see that a lot of these flows ultimately live on as digital documents and are not really embedded into the tech stacks. And that basically leads to a broken feedback loop, and we're actually missing out on the improvement possibility there. So if we take a step back and we look at the practice of software development in the last decade, the practice of DevOps has led worldwide organizations to improve their software development practice. And so ultimately DevOps has led to faster software delivery, faster bugs resolution issues, and ultimately higher software quality. And we believe that CareOps has the same potential for care flow development. So faster time to market for your care services, increased operational efficiency or lower cost, whatever you want to look at it, and ultimately a higher quality of care. So let's the first theme of this webinar, and this is also where we will go into the intros. So we have three teams ultimately. Team one is what is the value of a team-based care model? Team two is building a care team, and theme three is organizing and scaling a care team. So let's go into theme one. What I would love for each one to do, and I don't think there's going to be a lot of skeptics in the audience, but it's always good to start with the basics. So what I would love you all to highlight is what is, according to you, the biggest value of team-based care, and for your organization. So please introduce your organization and what is, according to you, the biggest value of team-based care. And we'll do the inverse as the icebreaker questions. So please, Sandy, if you could start us off.
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm Sandy Varatharajah. I'm one of our ops leaders here at Firsthand. And Firsthand is serving Medicaid individuals who are living with serious mental illness, who also have a high medical complexity and are often labeled hard to reach or hard to engage by our healthcare system. Our workforce is primarily led by peers who are people with lived experience themselves with SMI, who know intimately what it's like to struggle to get treatment or fall through the cracks of our crumbling healthcare infrastructure. And we think that this shared lived experience can be a really powerful engagement driver for the individuals that we serve. And our peers are also part of a larger care team that includes community resource guides and health guides that are helping individuals get plugged into the right social programs and the right care programs for them. And as I alluded to in my answer, I think the biggest value of team-based care is engagement. It is impossible for any one person to address all of a patient's social and physical needs, but a team-based approach does get you a little bit closer. And if you believe that shared lived experience is a powerful broker in building trust and getting individuals to change their behavior, ultimately change their health outcomes, then the team-based approach is the way to go. So.
Great. Thank you, Sandy. Jamie?
Navigating the new computer. Yeah, I mean, I agree with much of what Sandy said. So from a introduction organizational standpoint, as mentioned, I run our network strategy and operations here at Maven. Maven, being the largest virtual clinic serving women and family health, largely does so through team-based approaches. providing asynchronous and synchronous video visits, content, and community for really every family exploring fertility, preconception, maternity, pediatrics, now all the way up through menopause. And I think really a hallmark of our team-based care is around access. So Maven's interesting in that it has over 30 specialties. Half of those specialties are more kind of like classically licensed MDs, so OBGYNs, pediatricians, and the other half of those specialties are coaching and wellness focused, so lactation consultants, doulas. So Maven is able to offer members all of these specialties on one platform where those providers not only have the specialty and subspecialties to answer the breadth of member questions, but can also refer to one another, talk to one another. And then we also have specific assessments and care plans that stratify high-risk members to make sure we're supporting members even more when they need it. So overall, I would say the biggest value of team-based care to Maven is just member support, member engagement, member satisfaction. But I also don't want to lose sight of the provider satisfaction component, because I think a big outcome of this is that providers are answering the questions they're meant to answer. You have a reproductive endocrinologist answering more high-risk cases or questions that are more complex versus a reproductive nurse that's answering best practices or tips and tricks when you're injecting yourself for the first time with IVF drugs. So it's this whole like top of license mentality and ability to actually resolve your patient, your member's needs, which ultimately that's the goal in the simplest form, to drive outcomes and cost savings and everything else that comes.
Okay, thank you very much, Jamie. Joel?
Yeah, a pleasure to be here. Joel Haugen from Crossover Health. For those that aren't familiar with Crossover's model, Crossover's been around for a little over a dozen years, supporting mostly self-insured large employers. We support the building and collaboration of on-site clinics, near-site clinics that are built either for private purposes of our employee populations or shared in some large metropolitan areas. And then we also support virtual. And then these populations also engage in can be engaged virtually, asynchronously through messaging or in person to provide that care. And from a team-based perspective, we support biopsychosocial needs of the entire population. So that includes mental health, primary care, physical medicine, chiropractic, physical therapy, and then care navigation, acknowledging as we talk about team-based care, it's one thing for what we can do within our four walls or our proverbial four walls of our care team. How do we support beyond that? I think Sandy hit the nail on the head on engagement is one of the critical elements is how do we drive engagement? I would take it to kind of a next level, which would be a relationship. And that trusted relationship that that person is calling you in times of need, that they are listening to your advice on changing your behavior. To me, having a team that builds that trust, that keeps that individual engaged and building a trust of more than a simple singular episode or a singular symptom, but now managing their holistic needs ongoing, I think is critical to drive that relationship to be able to be there in a time of need, that we're the ones that call. So I would say the biggest value of team-based care is the relationship that it creates.
Great, thanks, Joel. Ajay?
Awesome. My name is Ajay Haryani. I work at Galileo. Galileo is a comprehensive primary care organization serving a pretty broad range of populations, including complex and underserved patient populations. We have two main components to our care model. We have a tech-first model, which is 24/7 virtual primary care, primarily asynchronous. Not only for healthy folks, actually treating up to a fair degree of complexity. And then we have what we call kind of a human first model, which is focusing on those complex kind of last mile populations who require more in-person support. For this population, we've launched a complex care delivery arm, bringing care into the community, into the home, providing multiple layers of support around both Medicare and Medicaid patients. I spend most of my time on the complex care delivery arm, where I am both a primary care provider here in New York, in Brooklyn, as well as a clinical leader helping build and operationalize our care model. And so when I think about team-based care, I really think about it from the lens of the care model. And if you think about care delivery and service design, there's all these different axes along which you can toggle the type of touch point that you're delivering, right? There's location, home, street medicine, clinic, virtual, sync versus async, duration of visit, group visit versus solo visit. But in my mind, one of the most important and powerful toggles there is who the person is delivering the service. And this is where I think team-based care is really potent and powerful. From the lens of clinical utility and high quality care, who that person is really matters. If you have a BH need, if you have a social work need, et cetera. From the lens of efficiency and kind of the care model and OpEx, and really from the lens of patient experience, for your need in that moment, patients are happier when they're talking to the right person who can most effectively address that problem and who knows how to address that problem. And so, especially from the perspective of a value-based care organization, what that unlocks in my mind is all of these layers in between kind of health and sickness, right? Between home and the emergency department or inpatient care. And I think team-based care is really what does the majority of that unlock.
Great. So I think a lot of the themes have already been touched that we will dive deeper on in the session. Now, before we do that, I'd like to pick up the role of advocate of the devil for a second. And so let's say that, everything I hear sounds highly complex. And clinical staff already eats away most of my gross margin as a care provider. So should I really be expanding that cost further and make my life more complex? Because I now have to hire, train, set targets for actually a very diverse set of people. It also introduces a big coordination problem, right? If my team members are not well aligned, there's going to be a lot of communication. There's going to be potentially a lot of idle time with very little to account for. So my question is, doesn't the cost to set up and run team-based care models outweigh the value that it brings? Sandy.
Is that an open-ended? I'll take that one, Thomas.
Bill, yeah. I was looking at who was nodding. Who was nodding?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's a challenge in the United States, at least in terms of healthcare for us, particularly in their investments in primary care and these types of team-based models. So for us, it's establishing. Your first question is, what is the ROI of that investment? What are we trying to measure in terms of that, and acknowledging that it's more than simple claims reduction in year that you measure through an actuarial model. It also has to include the value of the investment for the employer, the retention, the productivity, the recruitment, the physician satisfaction. At Crossover, our model is we don't get paid through a traditional claims system. So we are not paid in any fee for service. We don't engage with insurance companies to get paid on a transactional basis. So it's a very different model for us. So our clients and our partners, our large employers, are investing in this dedicated care model because it improves access and it improves experience. But to your point, Thomas, yes, that increases the costs, and we have to show the value of those costs in terms of utilization, experience, and outcomes, clinical outcomes, financial savings outcomes, et cetera. And then the tactical devil advocate question you asked around kind of the tactical of how to work together as a team, the operational challenges. I think it starts with culture. Who you hire that's engaged and excited about working in a team-based model. You're not going to force that by an acquisition or force that through partnerships that are loose. So for us, they're all salaried people that buy into the model when they start day one at Crossover. And they meet daily in the morning through the huddle concept, and they meet both our virtual team and our in-person teams have that deep cultural integration to work together, and they work down the hall, either physically or virtually, to establish that. And then you need to have the technology that makes it as easy as possible, and to your point, efficient as possible, so it becomes cost effective. Not an easy task, and I think a lot of us, at least I'll speak for Crossover and others in the industry, we're just starting to kind of push down that journey. There's a lot of work to go, but the results often speak for themselves in terms of the patient satisfaction, in terms of the commitment of the relationship ongoing. And for physicians, I think we have a shortage of physicians. They want to operate at the top of license. They want to work with partners and collaborators in this team-based model. So it actually increases the retention and reduces any of the loss of our staff. And that has cost elements too. So I think that tends to help outweigh some of the investments that we make in the model itself.
Great. Anyone care to comment? Yeah, please, Sandy.
Great answer, Joel. I want to build on that a little bit more. And from the lens of everyone on this panel is working at a tech-enabled service company. So the product we are offering is a service. I think a big part of the problem is defining even what team means. Is it just, the physician and the MA and the social worker that's working in the clinical room and going from patient room to patient room? Is it also your practice manager and your schedulers at the front desk that are driving a lot of the efficient operations? Is it also your shared services that are working behind the scenes on tech and ops to drive systems and process? What about your community providers? And I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, but I think like in many ways, this question is a very valid one, because everyone sitting in this panel and in the audience would answer this question differently, and then therefore solve for a different problem. So I think it's our job as leaders to abstract that complexity from our frontline workers so that they don't feel penalized every time they're working their absolute hardest, or they're not constantly doing this mental math in the background to figure out things. Oh, one thing I forgot to add on the layer of venture backing, which demands a certain level of growth in a rapid time frame, plus dozens of contracts, each with their own set of quality measures. Teams start building their own set of incentives and metrics, and as Joel pointed out, therefore culture. So our job as leaders to abstract that complexity. I think three things help. The first is really intentional technology, right information, right place, right action. I know that this is what Awell and CareOps are all about. Second is really good leadership. And I don't mean charismatic leadership alone, but someone who is able to understand business drivers, that can maintain rigorous performance management. If an MA comes to a leader and says, why am I chasing a patient for the next 2 weeks to get them to pee in a cup? Can they answer why? And can they do it in a compelling way that rallies the team around it? And then finally, like Joel pointed out, like good tech teams, care teams should have good rituals. They should have good morning huddles. They should have weekly case conferences where they're talking about their most complex members. They should have good practices of documenting next steps and having accountability with ownership, right? So I think this is where a lot of tooling can come into play, but unfortunately, and it might be because of the venture backing structure, there tends to be a lot of offshoots that don't really target any of these tenets, I think.
Quickly on that point as well, Sandy, that was an excellent overview of all the operational components to make team-based care, quote unquote, worth it from an ROI perspective in some of the investments. And I also just want to second the need to define what team-based care is, perhaps a bit more broadly, and also be very aware of what your baseline is in any of these cost models and the timeline it might take to achieve any of the dollar savings you might be looking for. But the only thing I wanted to add is that I think there are unique extensions on the delivery model that can also not only drive member satisfaction, but the cost savings you would be looking for to offset some of the investments. So I think Ajay even mentioned like class-based models, group-based models. We found that Maven members have been really satisfied with classes. It's something they really enjoy. You can meet other members going through similar journeys. Similarly, the virtual versus async care, which is even in addition to brick and mortar care. So there's a lot of different areas that you can lean into and get creative to offset the dollars and cents while also driving outcomes and member satisfaction.
Great, thanks.
Awesome.
Ajay,
Yeah,
go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, I echo a lot of what everyone said so far. I'll just add on two kind of small points. One, I think is, in order to make, hiring a team alone and throwing them into a care model, throwing them at patients is not going to achieve your cost savings, right? You have to think very, very intentionally about what the role of each team member is. And not only that, and the one thing I really want to call out here is that, especially as you're bringing in folks who are non-clinicians, you're often undoing a lot of training that the traditional healthcare system has done for them, which is a lot of like disempowerment that's happened for a lot of folks in these different roles. And one of the things I think about often is when I was inpatient back in San Francisco working inside the hospital, the most powerful person in that hospital was the palliative care social worker. Every single patient wanted to talk to her. She was the person that everybody imprinted on, and she was the one that people looked to for what most value-based care orgs would think would be as, the most high value decisions in that patient's life, for that matter. And so, it's a very active process in training up those individuals, leveling them up, empowering them, and giving them the space to create that impact, which they're not trained to do in the traditional system. And then, just one of the other kind of things that I think about a lot from the care model perspective and from the service design perspective is, as you bring in these team members, which one of these services can you centralize? Who really needs to be a field-based team? Who really can be a central team? And how can you then kind of democratize that impact across as many people as possible? Of course, you don't want to over-centralize and kind of commoditize a service that requires that human touch, but being really thoughtful about that trade-off is another way to kind of impact that ROI calculation.
Okay, great. I think this concludes the initial theme, but we've opened up several cans of worms and other types of animals that we'll talk about more. But so the initial theme of what is the value and what's the cost of team-based care? Some great answers there. The next theme is about building a care team. And we also have a poll for that. So Rick will trigger the poll for the audience. And so actually Sandy already alluded to it, right? Who is part of the care team? And I have one important question, and it's related to the following. So patient-centered care is maybe one of the biggest bingo words of the past decade, right? But to me personally, it has a connotation that the patient is passive and that the care team works around and in service of the patient. So shouldn't we all see the patient as an integral part of that care team and also proactively contribute to their own health? What are your thoughts on that? Sandy, because you didn't want to go into the rabbit hole, please kick us off.
No, I'm kind of kicking myself that I didn't include the patient there, because that's why we're all here. We're doing everything in service of them and with them. At firsthand, one of our core tenets of our care model is our teams work with individuals to build a self-management plan. And a lot of companies have something similar, whether it's a shared mission or something where the patient is buying into the goals that are being set, and building SMART goals or OKR, so to speak, in pursuit of that. If somebody wants to become an astronaut as their goal, maybe the first step is, well, let's get a GED and let's move you along on that path. So absolutely agree that patients should be part of that. And we shouldn't be assuming things on their behalf and building things that may not land with them.
A follow-up question that came in through the chat is, and not just the patient, but what about their family, friends, etc.? How do you bring all of those people into the mix? Because ultimately, let's be honest about it, they don't cost as much as hiring another clinician, right? So how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. A fair chunk of my patient panel is a geriatric home-based population. So they're relatively immobile, lots of caregiver support, lots of caregiver burnout. And many of them have home health aides that are hired through the city or the state there. And so I think all the time about what's the most effective way to make sure those folks are at the table. And honestly, the simplest interventions are the most powerful in my experience, which is, somebody's son or daughter being able to text in and check in with us when something's going on with their mother or somebody that they're looking after. And same with the home health aides. It's really, when you walk into the home, treating them as a part of the team up front. So it's not that they walk out of the room and you go sit next to the patient, but you bring them back in and you sit in a circle and have a conversation together. You give the home health aide the phone number of the practice to say you text in if something else happens, and you make them feel just as kind of accountable, but also just as empowered to be a part of that care team. And then there's honestly an element of even kind of coaching and leveling up that I think everybody who works in geriatric care does for these populations, which is, how do you actually help the caregivers, the home health aides, all of these folks both access the resources that they need, but also, just support the patient in any way they can. So I think there's a cultural component, and then there's a bit of a tactical, just opening up those lines of communication and making them very, very, very low activation energy, welcoming that inbound, I think goes a really far way.
We are primarily an employer targeted service, some of which is on site. So we have a little bit of more of a challenge in engaging with the broader family, just by the dynamic of how we're supporting. But with that said, I think this does highlight where we are heavily focused on, and I would say the family in general is an extension of the social determinants of health problem, is that there are elements that happen outside of the care that we provide, outside of the care that any medical provider provides, that whether it's a caregiver, whether it's a family member, are uniquely positioned to help support, or maybe it is a community service offering or other capabilities that can help address those needs. So whether it's a transportation concern, whether it is a food desert concern, whether it is a domestic abuse concern, or whether it's behavioral style changes. So acknowledge that I believe in the importance of the family being a part of that story, and think more broadly, if it's not a family member, how can we support through community services or other capabilities outside of the traditional medical offering?
Okay, great. Now, one of the things I hear coming back again and again is so lots of different roles, lots of different locations, synchronous and asynchronous modalities. So what that makes me think about is, a rock band doesn't need a conductor, right? But an orchestra needs a conductor. So at what size does a care team start needing somebody who coordinates things before things start falling apart? Maybe Jamie, because at Maven you have 30 plus specialties. Maybe you could kick us off to enlighten us what practical approach can you take to make sure coordination is efficient?
Yeah, I like that analogy between a rock band and a symphony and what needs a conductor. I think it comes back to intentionality of the care plan, which I feel like has come up before. So for this to work well, we need to know where we're going and the outcomes we're trying to drive, and it can't necessarily be a free-for-all. So what that means is, for example, when members join Maven, their very first touch point is with their own dedicated care advocate. These are incredible people, largely social worker backgrounds, that know Maven's product in and out. They know all the providers, they know all the specialties, they know all the subspecialties. They can match based off of member preference for demographic, language, time zone. So that's kind of like step one. And then members also go through assessments and will be triaged into specific care plans. So this arguably is even a non-human conductor, in that there are a set of actions that we would like this member to follow and complete in order to achieve the outcomes, whether it's reduced anxiety and mental health improvements, or we've also seen like 20% reduction in unnecessary C-section rates because you go through birth planning exercises and get your questions answered quickly. And then this care advocate will make sure you're keeping on track and will meet with you as many times as you want. So I think in some team-based care models, it might make sense for a clinician to be this conductor. I think in other cases, it can be more of a subclinical care advocate, and every model is going to be different, but that's the way Maven really has seen success thus far.
Maybe a quick question before anybody else reacts, Jamie, from the audience. What is the average care team size for a given patient at Maven?
It's a good question. So when we think about care plan delivery, we might have 3 to 5 different specialty types loosely, whether that might be nutritionists, mental health, OBGYN, and then subclinical coaches. But we also like to weave in really actions in the purest sense. So checking out community groups, making a plan, checking out certain resources. So it might not solely be a visit with a provider is the nuance there.
Great. So, and anybody else on ideal team size before things start falling apart?
I'll just add that Ajay said a good comment earlier, right? It's this dynamic of the non-clinical and the clinical staff and finding that right balance. We have to do this efficiently. So there might be, everyone may prefer an MD-led model with lots of clinicians, but we also have to balance the cost effectiveness of that in an ROI model. And so finding and empowering people to do self-care is important. Finding ways to do it in shorter amounts of time is important, and working through some of those dynamics. But the average size is really dependent, I would argue, based on the population you're serving, So we support largely a commercial population. So we're not supporting Medicare, we're not supporting Medicaid, which have a very different dynamic. As you know, most Medicaid populations are smaller, but we at least ground our model based off of the panel size of the primary care provider. So you start with the primary care provider, you say, how many primary care providers do we need to support this population? And then we estimate based on the number of mental health necessary physical medicine to support that same group. So we tend to have fewer mental health and primary care providers dependent upon the population, and more in other populations. So I would say the general team size for us starts with a primary care physician as the quarterback, and then the size of the team can vary depending upon the client. But I think we're finding trends more and more that you actually want to have an increased number of non-clinical staff on that team through care navigation, through hosts, through MAs and others to support that work, so you can drive it profitably. But I think at least for us, the size is all variable based on the primary care panel size.
Great. I'm going to move on to the next question. So you all four of you have clearly been very successful at finding your care teams and hiring them, right? And so today we're seeing a lot of provider shortages, and hiring talented care team members is a challenge. On top of that, those who you hire, we are seeing the labor costs skyrocketing off. So for all of the people in the audience who are just starting out, what could be really practical tips for them to find, and then we will talk about retention later on, but it's mainly how to find skilled clinical staff and care teams in an affordable way.
I might throw into the ring here, and it's related to the last question a bit, which is a lot of companies say that they want their care teams to be representative of the patients that they serve. Hence, they hire from the very communities that they serve. And that may create a virtuous cycle for some companies where the people you're serving, I mean, obviously depending on qualifications, if it's for an MA versus an MD, but at least for our peers, they are people with lived experience with SMI. Those are also the individuals that we're serving. If, maybe a couple of years from now, the very people that we're serving also end up joining our workforce too. So I think that's a model with good culture and good career pathing focused on your community teams, not your data scientists or your ops managers. You can attract a workforce really well that way.
Okay. Maybe one comment, and then we'll move on. Go ahead, Joel. Yeah.
I was going to say it's a great challenge, and I'd say it does tie to retention a little bit. So I'll try to avoid, Thomas, so we can punch that later on. But I think the key for us, I completely agree with Sandy. Right, having people that understand the local, at least is an ideal model. So you understand the local challenges, the food desert challenges. You understand where they live. You understand the culture. These are people who look like you. These are people who have the same similar backgrounds as you. So that is a critical part of our model. You have to compensate them appropriately and reward them for outcomes, and they're excited about that. So we're not charged based on RVU or panel sizes to finance that. We're not asking you to stay up late at night charting CPT codes so we can submit claims to the insurance company in our model. And so those things are really attractive especially for those clinicians that are coming out of school and other areas that are excited to practice at the top of their license. So that to me is the area we were able to largely recruit, is can we find ways to get you practicing at the top of license with people culturally aligned with you, and focusing where you're spending much more of your time on patient care than the administrative elements of healthcare. And that tends to not just acquire and engage individuals into our care model, but retain them if they're here.
Okay, great. So this actually concludes our second theme, which was building a care team. Now, just for the record, the audience is in large agreement. So 97% does think that the patient should be an active part of the care team. So I think we're all aligned there, which is great.
I'm so curious what the other 3% thinks, if they don't mind putting some comments in.
Yes, so if you've answered no to whether the patient should be active part, the patient and their family should be active part of the care team, please use the chat to enlighten us. So on to theme 3, which is about organizing and scaling a care team. And I see that time is flying. Rick, could you please trigger the next poll? because this is again a question we'd love to have the audience's feedback on. So Joel talked about the relationship. Jamie talked about the care advocate being the first touch point. I've heard both Sandy and Ajay as well on the importance of the patient seeing the same care team member or members throughout their care journey. To what extent is that important? Should the patient always interact with a maximum amount of the same care team members? Should it be at least one person that they build a relationship with, and can the rest, let's say, satellite around that with different people, or doesn't it really have a proven impact on outcomes, for example? Maybe Ajay, if you could start us off.
Yeah, I think that the answer to this question is, in the vein of what we were discussing, quite patient dependent, and really lies on a spectrum of, I think probably the easiest surrogate for how I think about this is the complexity of the patient that you're managing. I found that and there's some assumptions built in here that we have to make sure are actually true for that patient, where the patient who maybe has one or two medical problems, less complex, may actually prefer to have in their own life optimize for accessibility and responsiveness over seeing the same person over and over again. And if you can provide that from a trusted brand, as you know, so for us, it's, you know, the idea of building that brand presence around Galileo, building that trust with the entire organization and not just that frontline care member, then I think you can do that patient a huge service. And in many cases, I've seen that patient prefer that. They'd prefer to interact with the brand over than having, you know, to sacrifice the other variables there. I think as you move along the complexity spectrum, the clinical nuance increases there, and you more and more need a stronger, more human-centric relationship to make difficult, heavy decisions. And so that becomes more important. And I think that, you know, at the end of the day, you also need, in the vein of the last question we just said, is, you know, that quarterback is more and more important to be a single person or 1 to 2 people as compared to the less complex person, just because there's a lot of nuance there that can get lost if you don't have the right, you know, systems built to support it. So that's how I think about it.
I can't imagine anyone answering that question and saying, you know, I want to work with like 50 people. Can it just run them through the gamut? I assume that's the balance that AJ was getting to, right? The first dynamic is, was it a good experience? If it wasn't a good experience, I want to be able to choose someone different. So don't keep pushing me back to the same person I didn't have a good experience with, number one. But number two is, how important is the trade-offs of a relationship to convenience? And balancing that, I want someone to respond within a minute or 15 minutes, or I want this trusted partner to respond to me within 6 to 8 hours, you know, in between appointments or following up at the end of the day with all of their outstanding items. And I think that is a delicate balance to manage, and finding that right balance. And I agree with AJ. I think the balance is really around the population you're serving. Is the expectation convenience? Is the expectation relationship? We have a principle at Crossover that tends to lean more towards the relationship. We believe in the important and passionate, but that means we, at the expense of what may be perceived as, you know, traditional virtual urgent care and responsive within 5 minutes and addressing those needs. But we believe at the end of the day that you know, having that relationship is critical for the long-term success of that member managing their own care and building that trust. So, but I think it's a challenge. I think it depends on the population that you're engaging with to make that call.
Yeah, that's great. A next question I have is the following. I'm just looking at my question. So our audience is really looking for really tactical, practical tips. And I think we all agree high level on a lot of the things that are being said, but could you each give a practical tip about, you know, what have you realized since the day you started that if you would know it now, you would do differently, so that people don't fall into the same traps as what you've fallen in with regards to building and organizing a care team. So a really practical thing. Watch out for X, please.
Just because I feel like we sidestep the tactical provider recruitment questions. This is something that I spent a lot of time in, and it is not meant to be a trite response when I say hire a good provider recruitment team. Like, you need dedicated people focused on this. Clinical recruitment is nuanced, not the same as regular recruitment. Sometimes there's different metrics involved. There's different best practices in building pipeline and sourcing. Like Maven has found success in even just LinkedIn for coaches and wellness versus medical groups or listservs or Doximity for other traditional specialties. But I would say those are some tactical things to look into. And then my other favorite one, and I just say this over and over again every time someone asks, is hire like a great compliance person early on who has been there, done that, because they'll know the best credentialing vendor, the best licensure vendor, where you're going to get stuck on processes, how long things should take. And when you're building a provider network, if those providers are not credentialed or able to practice where you need them to practice, that's like, there's no access. So tips and tricks.
Great answer, Jamie. That's the kind of practicality we really like. So anyone else?
I would just say from a technology perspective, don't forget the care team. A lot of the prioritized features and functionalities when you're in tech-enabled service tend to lean more on the patient experience and helping with the features and functionalities that support them. And often we forget about, on the back end, the laminate cards and the Google Sheets and the other activities that have plagued a lot of these startup organizations for the medical group. So how can we, from a product perspective, again, that's my background, prioritize equally, if not favoring some of the care team needs to make sure that it streamlines their experience, that helps with not just efficiency, but patient satisfaction, which we are provider satisfaction, which we just indicated is so challenging. So that would be my advice, is making sure you have a dedicated product manager, dedicated product analyst, someone who's constantly keeping the voice of the care team in addition to the voice of the member front and center as you're planning your technology roadmaps.
Great, thanks.
Awesome. I'll just jump in quickly there on Jamie's point. Totally agree with the idea of really being really selective and thoughtful about the recruiting team for the different roles that you're hiring for. I actually think, especially the earlier you are, getting those care team members very involved in the recruiting process earlier helps train up that recruiting team to better understand the nuance that they're looking for. Some folks come in with this background and it's great to have, but the more buy-in you have from those care team members, and the more you kind of have a bit of a recruiting champion is what I do for each type of role that can work as almost a dyad partner with recruiting to continue to iterate and refine what their compass is. I think the faster you get to finding good candidates. And then the second point I'll make is just thinking really intentionally about folks that you are taking from the traditional healthcare system and bringing them into a younger startup environment. Just know the common, pitfalls that you're going to run into. Know that you need to spend time up front, getting them up to speed on Slack, email, owning their calendar, like these very micro tactical things. If you ignore them, will absolutely bite you in the butt down the line and create lots of inefficiency. And then working really consciously, and this is a little bit less tactical and more kind of broadly cultural, is just spending time talking to those folks and assimilating them into the kind of new culture that they're walking into, which may be very different than where they came from.
I'll quickly jump in and kind of tie something together that Joel and Ajay said, which is don't underestimate how hard it is to get raw real-time feedback from care teams. Most people we are hiring are coming from work environments where they're actively discouraged for giving feedback. Maybe they've been incarcerated before, and that actually carries trauma with giving feedback because you were punished for it. And there are lots of ways to solve around this. Some companies will embed a central resource in market, so they're constantly there liaising, giving feedback back to the central team. Obviously, this is where product shines, shadowing your care teams, understanding their workflows, their pain points. But I mean, that may be unrealistic for some companies to hire up or to send people out into the field and to have them spend an entire week just shadowing. On the other hand, like a lot of our team members have said that they're uncomfortable with Slack, or they're not, it takes them a long time to type out feedback offline. So one way we've done this is asked in one of our markets to have people send voice memos to us, because then it's just like quick, it's there. So think of creative ways to get that real-time feedback. And actually encourage it without just saying, give us feedback.
Great. I want to pick up on something Joel said. So Joel, can you tell us how you as a product leader at Crossover get input from the care team into how what product you design and build and how that will ultimately drive outcomes?
Yeah, I'm very fortunate to have a really strong design and product management team. So we have a singular dedicated product manager who lives and breathes full-time care team feedback and develops that into the roadmap of features and functionalities and into the appropriate cycles for squad development and scrums, et cetera. So that's part of the product management side of it. On the design side, we have a dedicated researcher as a part of our design team that does exactly the types of things that Sandy indicated, is looking at some of these broader ethnographic challenges, looking more holistically at surveys, looking at direct shadowing of our care team members, meeting with the monthly medical group and evaluating some of their key challenges. Some of them are very tactical, like, hey, I don't want to duplicate entrance of this data here and here. And some of them are larger philosophical around how we drive better integration between the team-based care. So in our world, we have a great partnership with Elation for our EMR, and then we've built a lot of technology on top of that to support our member relationship. So a lot of that is working with our partners as well, in this case, Elation, and collaborating with them and determining how we can enhance and support our care teams. But to us, it starts with the research. It's always data-driven, human-centered design, making sure that we are solving the problem and making sure that we understand that rather than just taking orders and moving a button here, really understanding what the problem we're trying to solve for and making it easier both for the care team and the member. And that starts with that research and design.
So how often can a care team or a care team representative provide input to the product team to co-determine that roadmap?
We have established product working teams, not just with this one individual, but every one of our capabilities that we develop that has a representative from the medical group. So we have individuals in the medical group weighing in on how we collect payments. We have a medical group member weighing in on how we do registration of our members, what push notifications we use to support our large strategic clients on mental health awareness month. So they are front and center on bi-weekly product working teams, not just for their specific needs, but also weighing in on the member experience and all the other priorities we have across all the product working teams. So I hope if you ask the medical group, they would say daily in real time, but there are a lot of more formal forums in this PWT model that we have to drive that more consistently as well.
I quickly second all of that. I work so closely with our product team, and the more that clinical and product can work in lockstep, quite frankly, the better. And I'm sure we're all in the thick of road mapping right now, looking at 2023, and probably have been for the past month or two. So making sure that you have that cross collaboration, readouts, and we also do like surveys, engagement surveys, NPS surveys, product testing, and have dedicated pods to certain delivery areas and involve clinicians or care team members as much as possible, quite frankly. So it's always the clinical requirements, the business requirements, the product requirements taken together.
So when we look at the clinical world, generally change is only possible if there's evidence that is a good change, right? But when we look at the product world, we want to be agile and experiment. And so can someone comment on how to marry those two mindsets and where they might fail?
Man, that's a challenge. Look at these tough questions. No softballs from Thomas. It is a great challenge of this. We are a measurement-based care organization at Crossover rather than an evidence-based medicine, kind of the next evolution that we focus on the outcomes based on the measurement. So how are we improving someone's physical movement? How are we focusing their behavioral health score? And there may be multiple paths to get there. So by nature, we allow flexibility and creativity within our care team, and similar to have that within our product organization. But there's a delicate balance here around how we drive that standard efficiency, how we make these decisions about failing fast and modifying. We've acknowledged that our care model is never done. We, along with the industry, need to constantly evolve our care model, looking at data. So again, data-driven, human-centered design. Is there, is the data showing that people are engaged in closing care gaps differently if they go this way versus this way? What's the cost of that? Is that more effective for asynchronous care to solve that problem? or otherwise. And so we partner extensively with the care team. And because we're more measurement-based care, because we're focused on the destination rather than the path, it allows us a little bit more flexibility and collaboration with our care team to make changes and to fail and find the right path with them on solving some of these challenges. But it isn't easy. There's constant examples where we've made changes technologically or they've made changes clinically that we've had to redirect and address and standardize the approach for consistency and for member experience.
One other thing I'll add there that I think makes this kind of another layer of complexity, you know, you've got kind of the safety component and kind of clinical values, clinical philosophy, which I think really comes down to your clinical cultures stemming from your clinical leaders and their ability to kind of crosstalk both with the folks that they're managing and with the kind of cross-functional leaders at the organization. But also this idea of rapid iteration is antithetical to the way most people have practiced in the healthcare system. And one thing that can do is start to feel almost Sisyphean for your care team members, is they finally get used to a certain process or pathway, and then you decide you're going to change it. They're used to like 1 to 2 year iteration cycles and feeling very, very comfortable in what they're delivering. And so that I think really requires what we were talking about in the last question, which is buy-in from the care team members in thinking through what those processes are and getting them excited about it. You know, at the end of the day, like everybody recognizes the limits of evidence-based medicine, and all clinicians have their own sense of clinical judgment. And when you open up the opportunity for them to be creative, like Joel was saying, and saying, you know, what do you think is the most effective way to actually achieve this outcome? I think most folks are surprised by how much clinicians are excited and to engage with kind of new ways of approaching patient care in that way.
Great. So it's disappointing how fast time flies in a webinar like this. I feel that like the last one, we can keep on chatting for a long time, but we're going to have to close off very soon. I just have one question left, and then an announcement on the next event that we're organizing with CareOps in January. So the last question, it might be a softball one, might not be. I will see, Joel. So if there is one metric that you want your care teams to look at every day, what is that metric?
We survey our members to ask if they're considered crossover their medical home. That to us is our North Star. Again, going back to that relationship, that's the best proxy for us to say, do our members truly trust us as their healthcare relationship?
Something similar, not quite NPS, but I would look at engagement measured by successful outreaches. How often are you touching base with a member? Are they calling into you and you're having a conversation? Individuals at the center.
Yeah, and I'll just highlight how often are they calling into you, in my mind, is one of the most intimate surrogates of trust there. You know, picking up the phone when you call them is one thing, but them reaching out to you in times of need, and that seeing that in your patient panel, I think is really powerful.
Pretty much echoes all of this, but the score of, did this provider resolve your issue? That's a pretty important one.
Okay, great. I want to thank all of the panelists for their time, the audience as well. I found this immensely interesting. There's actually many more questions that also got asked by the audience. So Rick and I will see how we can formulate answers on those or see how we do that. But in any case, it's a topic of great interest. This is obviously not the last event of CareOps. The next one is already planned. It is let's say building further on several of the topics that we talked about today. So it is about how to evolve from a one-to-one model to one-to-many care model. For that, we have a great guest, CMO at Babylon, currently Darshak Sanghavi, and that's coming in January 2023. Rick will be posting a link to the registration page, and obviously we'll also communicate about that on the careops.org, or if there's you can subscribe to the newsletter, and then you're aware of all the events that we're organizing. So with that, we're almost right at the top of the hour. Ajay, Sandy, Joel, Jamie, thanks a lot for your insights. the candid responses, taking the non-softballs questions. And thanks also to Rick for organizing this. As always, great to have you beside me. So have a great day, everybody. And we'll talk soon.
Thanks so much for having us. Take care.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.